The Democracy That Delivers podcast is brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at SIPE. This is the podcast where we talk about corruption in its many forms. And now to your host.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining today's edition of the Democracy That Delivers podcast, brought to you by SIPE's Anti-Corruption and Governance Center. My name is Barada Regmi and I'm the Program Officer for South Asia here at SIPE. I will be co-hosting today's podcast with my colleague Emma Yingst, the Program Associate for South Asia. And today we'll be talking about Sri Lanka and unpacking the latest anti-corruption efforts in the country. Our guest for today's segment is Sankita Gunaratne, the Deputy Executive Director of Transparency International Sri Lanka. And for our listeners, just a brief background. SIPE has been working in Sri Lanka for about a decade now, where our work has mainly focused on themes surrounding public finance and infrastructure governance. Last year, SIPE started a new partnership with TISL to work on anti-corruption initiatives, mainly focusing on improving Sri Lankan private sector's capacity in reducing corruption and promoting business ethics. But today, we will hear from Sankita on Sri Lanka's corruption landscape, the IMF bailout, and TISL's advocacy efforts. But before we jump into the discussion, we will provide some brief background. So, Emma, could you please sum up any relevant background information for our audience in 1 minute?
Well, Verada, that's quite a tall order, but I'll do my best to highlight what is most relevant for our listeners today. So, to begin, Sri Lanka experienced a people-led movement in 2022 when an economic and governance crisis spurred thousands of people to protest on the street against rampant corruption and the government's mishandling of the economy. Sri Lanka had been experiencing a crisis of debt with severely reduced government revenues and foreign reserves, which led to high inflation and significant shortages in essential items such as food, medicine, gas, and fuel. This is pegged as the worst economic crisis that the country has faced since gaining independence, and people viewed the government as culpable. Protests led to the resignation of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa on July 14, 2022. And while these recent events are major contributors to the people's movement and Sri Lanka's present-day state, it's also the result of years and years of mismanaged public funds by successive governments and the active undermining of democratic values. Barada, I'll now hand it back to you to provide some background on the IMF's involvement in Sri Lanka.
Thank you for the express summary, Emma. You managed to squeeze so much detail into less than a minute. Kudos to you. Moving on to the IMF topic, Sankita, as I understand, Sri Lanka has had a bittersweet relationship with the IMF since joining in 1950. Sri Lanka had previously secured about 16 to 17 IMF loans and now has an agreement with the IMF for an extended fund facility program for about 3 billion US dollars. The IMF states that its program measures are mindful of improving governance, and one of the objectives is to step up structural reforms to address corruption vulnerabilities, making this the first Sri Lankan IMF program to include governance and anti-corruption as a core pillar. So my question to you is, do you think the IMF program adequately reflects the key governance issues hindering Sri Lanka's development? And do you think that its conditions will facilitate necessary anti-corruption measures?
Thank you very much for having me on the podcast today. Hello, Barada and Emma, and thank you to SIPE as well. So, on your question of whether the IMF agreement adequately reflects the necessary governance reforms, I think we have to acknowledge that whether we like it or not, the IMF, unfortunately, is the biggest player in the room right now. If you speak about Sri Lanka's context, as you just alluded to, we have had protests, but we haven't really had a change of government. Those in power are still almost exactly those that were in power prior to the protests. So it's really important that our listeners also understand that, because what that means is that the entire popular uprising didn't really yield the system change that people demanded. So we have the same governance structures, the same people in power, with a change of president, but the current president really is not so much a break from the past. So then we're dealing with a legacy of bad governance that is continuing. So, in that context, the fact that the IMF has said that the corruption vulnerabilities in Sri Lanka are macrocritical, that in itself is extremely important. What that then means, of course, is that the IMF has also said that has started and now completed a governance diagnostic for Sri Lanka. So, because people have been demanding structural change, system change, changes, lasting solutions to the governance issues that we have been seeing, the fact that the IMF also has begun to require governance change as part of its structural benchmarks and prior conditions, and also as forming part of the ongoing agreement and the extended fund facility, is really, really important. And we know that some of the things that people have been asking for have made it to the governance diagnostic, have made it to the staff level agreement, which is really good. So, to answer your question in brief, the IMF has a massive role to play, and because of the way the chips are falling, the IMF's conditions, or what they call structural benchmarks, have now begun to dictate the reform agenda for Sri Lanka. We can get into it further as we go on.
Thank you so much. So, with that being said, do you feel that Sri Lanka is following the timeline for these corruption and governance measures set out in the IMF agreement?
To a certain extent, yes, but on some critical things, also no. So, for example, one of the requirements in the original staff level agreement, the original country agreement, was that Sri Lanka should maintain a fiscal transparency platform that displays all information related to tax exemptions. Now, this information is yet to be made public, even at the point a year later when we have just reached a staff level agreement as of yesterday, which will be submitted to the executive board of the IMF on whether the next tranche will be made available to Sri Lanka. Now, we know that revenue remains a huge issue in Sri Lanka, and there has been popular allegations of tax exemptions being granted to cronies, allies of those in power, that the tax net is not being effectively exercised, while at the same time we know that taxes have been increased for the poor, literally the poor in the country. We are seeing people making money as low as 100,000 rupees a month being subjected to higher taxes, and taxes on goods and services are increasing. So, to your question of whether progress has been made, or whether Sri Lanka is meeting its commitments, on certain things, yes, and on certain things, no. So, specifically related to anti-corruption reform, which is what I can speak mainly to, for example, there was a requirement, a structural benchmark, that an anti-corruption law should be passed by June this year. It was passed by September, October this year, but a lot remains to be seen in terms of implementation and enforcement. We are famous for having laws on paper that we don't implement. We are famous for signing on to international agreements. So we really are yet to see whether we can deliver on anti-corruption reform without just being limited to commitments on paper.
Thank you. I appreciate that answer. Changing gears a bit, I wanted to ask about the IMF's own governance diagnostic assessment, which you mentioned and which was published on September 30th. This is the first time the IMF has conducted an in-depth governance diagnostic exercise in an Asian country. I was wondering if you can share more about this, and also mention TISL's Civil Society Diagnostic Report and how it's connected to the IMF's diagnostic.
Yes, so where the IMF finds that corruption vulnerabilities are macrocritical, it has the discretion to carry out what they call a governance diagnostic. And this is based on the IMF's 2018 governance framework. So they look at issues like fiscal governance, financial sector oversight, central bank governance, market regulations, rule of law, money laundering and terrorism financing, things like this. So we found the IMF's governance diagnostic framework to be a little limited when you look at the corruption problem as a whole in Sri Lanka. So the IMF's governance diagnostic speaks to those points and is something that they do that would then form the basis upon which they can introduce further structural benchmarks or conditions to the government based on the findings on governance in a particular country. So that's what it set out to do, and the deadline was the 30th of September, and they put out their governance diagnostic. And in doing so, they consulted various government institutions as well as civil society. However, we as civil society felt, in the context that this was a critical moment for reform in Sri Lanka, that it's important to have what we call an autochthonous or a locally driven governance diagnostic as well. And this was done on the one hand to ensure that even the IMF would take a broad perspective of governance when conducting its own governance diagnostic. Because we have been consistently saying that Sri Lanka has begun to show the markers of state capture. Let's face it, we're living in a context where the executive has knowingly, illegally violated the citizens' right to franchise. They have postponed local government elections against the legislative timeline and as well as against a court order indefinitely. So that kind of thing we felt needs to form a core part of the governance diagnostic and could not be ignored. And we felt like the recommendations that we make also needed to capture things like that. So that's why civil society, a group of 6 civil society organizations led by TISL, took on its own governance diagnostic, took on doing its own governance diagnostic that it launched 2 weeks prior to the IMF's own governance diagnostic. We invited the IMF, other multilateral partners to be part of the launch, to recognize the recommendations made by civil society as well. So it's the first time that we're aware of across the world that civil society has galvanized in this manner. But in the IMF's own process, they also consulted us. So civil society continued to engage with the IMF and provide material and documentation and feedback as well. And whatever was requested was also provided so that we remained engaged in that process as well.
Thank you, Sangeeta. And you touched on this a little, but I wanted to delve deeper into this topic. You also mentioned that you had discussions with the IMF on the findings of the Civil Society Diagnostic Report. Do you feel that the Civil Society Diagnostic Report impacted IMF's assessment? And do you find that the IMF's governance diagnostic assessment addresses the concerns published in the Civil Society Diagnostic Report?
Thank you for that question. So we feel like the very active engagement of civil society has certainly strengthened the IMF's governance diagnostic, because some of the things that we talked about have definitely made it to the IMF's own governance diagnostic. And it certainly looks like some of the content in the civil society governance diagnostic has also made it to the IMF's governance diagnostic. So on the one hand, what we've said in our engagement, on the other hand, what we've said in our report has made it into the IMF's governance diagnostic. And I can say that the pressure from civil society to acknowledge the larger spectrum of what constitutes governance seems to have worked, because even the IMF's own governance diagnostic talks about public discontent around the postponement of elections and talks about the need for accountability. So the IMF's own governance diagnostic actually deals comprehensively or to a large extent with certain structural reform that is needed. So it talks about asset declarations, asset recovery, conflicts of interest, beneficial ownership, money laundering. So the kinds of things we need for the anti-corruption infrastructure, it does deal with a lot of things, but it's important that we don't only give government credit for, publishing the governance diagnostic, but make sure that we take this through to the next step. And in doing so, it's also important to ensure not to cut out the local stakeholders. Because the example I referred to before, the passage of an anti-corruption law, also constituted one of the structural benchmarks in the original country agreement. However, what we found as TISL on the ground was that the IMF had been giving technical assistance to that draft without necessarily consulting civil society on the specific technical aspects of the law. So TISL had to issue a press release, request to be included in part of those deliberations, and really wrestle our way into the process and make our recommendations known. And of about 150 changes that happened to that law, in the end, about 50 recommendations were made by TISL. So there was a lot of change that had to happen, and we even were cornered into the position of having to challenge this law in court because not all of our recommendations were sufficiently considered. So that does not amount to a good process. So just the fact that something made it to the IMF's governance diagnostic or even forms part of their structural benchmarks doesn't necessarily mean that the reform that people on the ground want gets reflected in that reform. And this is particularly important because whether we like it or not, because we want the money, the government will have to fall in line. So the reform will take place, but how well or badly that reform takes place is at stake. And these are long lasting reform that has long lasting consequences. So we can't afford to get this wrong, especially in the context of the protests that happen and the massive demand that exists for reform, and especially in the context that our representative democracy seems broken when people are being denied the right to vote.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's amazing that this advocacy effort has had that kind of impact on the anti corruption law. And of course, clearly, people on the ground care about how well the reform is implemented. But this makes me wonder, the IMF, do they have stake in the game? Whether is it more checking off that reform has happened, or do you feel that the IMF also has stake in it performing well or not? And ask, like, given both of the diagnostic reports and everything you've shared so far, what changes to the IMF program do you think are imperative before moving forward with the next tranche of money?
So it's a very interesting question you ask about the IMF's stake in actual reform. So the governance diagnostic report that they have issued seems to show a good degree of commitment to reform. However, the proof of the pudding will be in the eating of it. So we have to see how far the IMF continues to focus on actual implementation, and to your question, also how well it is done, not only how far. So if you look at the issue of increasing revenue, it's important to look at how that really happened. If you look at the domestic debt restructuring process, we have, as Sri Lanka, decided to touch the superannuation funds, which is basically also a form of social protection for the massive majority of the working class people in Sri Lanka. That's where all of our savings go. And that working class population has been forced to take on a haircut, while the big banks and wealthy private investors have been left out of the equation, have in fact made a killing in the process. So it is important that while the IMF, I understand sovereignty considerations, but that these critical questions are asked not purely based on outcome, but also based on process. And on another front, I think it's really important that the IMF actually considers its stake as being critical because it risks propping up corrupt regimes when it engages in this way. So if it doesn't really hold a government's feet to the fire in terms of implementation of structural reform, it risks propping up corrupt regimes, and it also risks its own funds being corrupted. Because if the money is going into a corrupt system, it can always be re-corrupted. And also, I think this has been a very interesting example of how the IMF engages with a government, which is its client, which is its primary client, when that government is seen as potentially being illegitimate. So it's something the world needs to watch, and the IMF also needs to take cognizance of as it goes forward. But I must say the governance diagnostic that has come out has, to my mind, been the strongest governance diagnostic that has been published so far. And I think, going to the previous question, also the fact that there has been active civil society, a lot of interest in this governance diagnostic locally would have yielded this kind of governance diagnostic, yielded the strength of this governance diagnostic. But it's an important lesson to learn for the IMF itself in engaging with this kind of government going forward as well.
Thank you, Sangeeta, for that. And it's really great to know that this governance diagnostic is the strongest that has come out. And to add to what you just mentioned, I think it is also valuable for the IMF to actively engage with CSOs to gain insights into the government's progress on reforms, because this may serve as a means to encourage the government to meet its commitments. And this ties in with my next question related to TISL's role in all this, in basically influencing the IMF to insist on governance reforms in Sri Lanka. What role is TISL playing, and how is TISL trying to influence the terms and conditions of the IMF bailout to ensure that necessary reforms are in place?
So one of the main things that we did, as we already talked about, was for the first time in the world actually issuing a CSO governance diagnostic. So now the work still remains to be done on the ground, both in terms of raising awareness, public awareness at the grassroots level about what the findings of the CSO governance diagnostic has been, and the need for people at the grassroots level, at elections, at whatever advocacy opportunity, to keep demanding this kind of structural reform. Because system change was a catchphrase that was a little fluid. It didn't have shape and form. So what the governance diagnostic, the CSO governance diagnostic has done really is to crystallize opinions of some 250 people who were part of the focus group discussions, people who were experts who contributed to the research, our own expertise that we've gathered through the years from the core group that contributed, the civil society core group that contributed. So the work remains to be done to take that out to the public along with the IMF governance diagnostic's own recommendations. But also, like what was done with the Anti-Corruption Act, going forward with the asset recovery law, proceeds of crime, making sure the anti-corruption agency, that is the Commission to Investigate Allegations of Bribery or Corruption, carries out its function. It's really important that organizations like TISL and other organizations related to those specific reform areas, that they continue to engage in advocacy. I talked about wrestling our way into these processes. The work is still going to be uphill because we know how opaque our governance structures can be, and the IMF also has a big role to play in terms of making sure civil society access is given going forward. But a lot remains to be done on ensuring that the local constituents remain part of the main stakeholders of the reform that happens, so that the reform is done for the better than for the worse. And also, not just with the IMF, TISL has gone to court on the economic crisis, to the Supreme Court, asking that those responsible for the economic crisis be held accountable. Why did Sri Lanka delay in going to the IMF? Why did we decide to repay a loan through our reserves when we should have known, or to have known, that the country was facing a massive crisis in terms of debt and reserves? Then why did Sri Lanka decide to peg the dollar at a certain amount, against the advice of experts? So these are all questions we have also taken to the highest tribunal in the country, the Supreme Court, asking for accountability as well. So advocacy continues on many fronts.
Thank you, Sangeeta. And the joint advocacy effort seems unique to have a pairing of civil society folks on the ground in Sri Lanka, then someone like TIUS in DC pressuring the IMF itself. And since we're running short on time, I have one final question to wrap up the discussion. So, thinking ahead, if the TISL's joint advocacy campaign on the terms and conditions of the IMF bailout were to be successful, what will this mean for other countries? I mean, Sri Lanka is just another country in the list of countries that is receiving IMF intervention. Why do you think this effort in Sri Lanka is so important, and what meaning does it carry for other countries who may be in similar situation in terms of needing IMF interventions?
Absolutely. I think this effort at the local level can serve as a model for other countries to follow, in the context that so many countries are about to go through another round of debt restructuring. So civil society engagement can only help strengthen the process, and there is a lot at stake, therefore, when we look at what the outcome of this experiment is going to be. I think Sri Lanka cannot afford to fail for its own sake, because we are at such a critical situation locally, and there is huge public discontent about corruption, so much so that we are having massive outflows of the human capital of the country, people migrating, lock, stock and barrel. Everyone we know seems to be migrating or considering migration, or forced to respond to that question of why you are not migrating when things are so bad. So Sri Lanka has a lot to lose for its own sake if it does not get this right, but for the sake of other countries who will be dealing with the IMF in this manner, and especially on the front of civil society engagement, I think we cannot afford to get this wrong. So I'm hoping that this model will serve as an example to other countries who will hopefully follow suit.
Thank you, Sangeeta. And this brings us to the end of our today's podcast. I want to express my sincerest gratitude for your insightful contribution on this complex but important topic, Sangeeta. So very, very thank you. And Emma, I'm grateful for the opportunity to host this podcast with you. And to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Listen and subscribe to SIPE's Democracy That Delivers, wherever you get your podcasts.